My boyfriend uninvited me to a week-long trip because his girl best friend is uncomfortable with me. Now he is freaking out because I am throwing away our real timeship. Plus one update. My boyfriend wanted to vacation this summer to his mom's friend's house in Hawaii with me and his two best friends. We had been planning on this all spring, and at some point, one friend dropped out of the trip, leaving just the three of us. In early June, once the friend unexpectedly dropped out of the trip, May called my boyfriend and told him that now that it was just the three of us, she didn't feel comfortable with me going on the trip since she didn't know me that well, and she didn't want to be a third wheel. She said she wouldn't go on the trip if I were to go. Without telling me that this was happening, they changed the plans and made it a trip just for the two of them, and they changed the location to a beach in Costa Rica. I was trying to figure out when to ask for time off this summer and hadn't heard the news about the plans, so I asked my boyfriend which week in August I should set aside for the Hawaii trip. He let me know that, actually, he had talked to his friend, and that she didn't want to go if I were going, so he was going to go alone with her to Costa Rica. He said we could go another week later, maybe to Mexico City. I was upset and tried to talk with him about how the situation made me feel, especially since this wasn't a case of a separate trip being set up ahead of time. This was a case of me being invited and then uninvited from a week-long tropical vacation with a girlfriend of his who I had never met before. We eventually decided to make a trip together to Copenhagen, which we both wanted to visit, as compensation. I also asked to meet her to feel more comfortable with the trip. We spent the 4th of July going to see her and her boyfriend in the city where they live, and although it was nice to put a face to a name, it was ultimately a very cold trip, and she was not at all welcoming to me. My boyfriend remarked on how unfriendly she was to both of us, he thought, and said he was surprised she didn't act warmly to me. I went out of my way to get to know her and her boyfriend, but it didn't really click, even after several days. They were somewhat cold to each other as well. They bickered a little about their future and his 3-week trip without her, which was scheduled for the same time as their trip. This had been my effort to feel better about the trip, so I told my boyfriend that I still didn't feel comfortable with things and was insulted by how it was handled. I had tried to make things smooth between us, and I asked him to please come up with something to help me feel better about the trip. On a visit to his family, they asked about the trip. They were all shocked that he would have arranged it this way. They told me they would have been furious if they were in my position, which triggered a fight in which I asked him to please help come up with a strategy to make me feel better and more secure about them going together without me. He said he would never do this kind of thing again, which feels like not much to offer since this is a once-in-a-lifetime trip. He kind of offered not to go on the trip, but he had already paid for the tickets and made arrangements, and I didn't want to stop their trip and be resented by both him and his best friend. He asked me to give him ideas of how to make me feel better and wanted me just to tell him what to do and stalled until it was finally the day of the trip. He bought me a bag of peanut butter cups, and I drove them to the airport. I feel so disregarded and disrespected in this situation. I want to break up with him but don't want to burn up something that has otherwise been really good. Update: I was really upset the day I dropped him off, and he was texting me, but I wasn't responding. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I didn't want to do anything at all in the state I was in. I waited until the next day, and then I sent him a thought-out text letting him know that I didn't feel safe or loved in how the trip was handled and that I would be dropping his things off at his place and leaving his keys with the neighbor. He called but left no messages. He then messaged me that he didn't understand. He called and messaged me the rest of the week, but I couldn't bring myself to pick up or text back. On Thursday, I think he realized that I was serious and asked me some logistical questions. I told him which neighbor his key was with, etc. When he got back and saw everything at his place, he got pretty frantic and called and left me a long message. I was working all day but still didn't want to respond. He asked me to explain because he didn't understand what was happening. The next day, I sent another text to clarify that it was over, and he got upset and sent me a bunch of texts in a row about how he didn't understand why I was throwing away everything we had built. He left me an angry voicemail and said he had no idea why I was upset that he did not accept the breakup because he had no say in it, and that he wanted me to tell him the evil story that I had made up about him to his face. I wasn't going to respond to him, and I wanted to remain calm, but this upset me. So I sat down to write him this letter. I tried to call him, but I started crying and told him I'd just send him an email instead. This is what it said. The time we have had apart has given me some good space and time to think. I have had a chance to think about the important things for me in a relationship, and I see that we should not be together. From the very start, this trip was made in an insanely disrespectful way. It started out with you being given an ultimatum by your female best friend, who I had never met, that either she goes or I go on this trip, and you picked her. You didn't offer to have her meet me, you didn't encourage her to find someone else to come, and you didn't consult me at all. That's enough for most people to have a deal breaker right there. However, I stayed. This is a person who you have a history with that is not entirely clear to me. You did not tell me this was happening until I asked when the trip to Hawaii would be. You purchased tickets in another very disrespectful situation, in which I cooked dinner and had guests present. You choose to go into my room for well over an hour to select tickets with her, and I repeatedly ask you to please come to dinner because you say it will just be a few more minutes each time. There is no reason for doing it at that time and in that situation, seeing as she is in the same time zone as us and has a 9-to-5 job. This makes me feel sick to my stomach. Your dad, mom, and grandparents are all very surprised when we tell them about this trip. It is becoming very obvious that this is a dangerous trip to make with the fragility of our relationship. She arrived at my place very late, and we woke up the next morning so I could take the two of you to the airport. After this lead up, I know you can tell how unhappy I am. I fully absolutely know you can tell how unhappy I am. You leave, and when I don't respond to your text messages, you text me to tell me that you hope I'm okay and you're going to bed. No call. The rest of the week was rough. My text to you was met with, essentially, I'm sorry you feel this way. You tell me that I'm being unfair. There is no acknowledgement, and there still has been none, that this trip to a F-King honeymoon destination, as we have discussed before, could be a crazy and horrible thing to go through with, even with my quasi-blessing. This is not something that people in relationships have to deal with. I guess this is not something that people in relationships do besides me. In the end, all of this is to say that I have felt serious emotional needs go seriously unmet in a way that is a deal-breaker for me. There have been some wonderful, very positive times. Still, there has been unnecessary heartache and suffering for me over things that come down to what I can only assume are personal differences. I cannot handle your relationship with May. And I suppose I could ask you to pick between her and me, but that's not what I want to do. I want you to have your best friend, and I want to leave. I did love you, but I am not about to fight this fight and hear you tell me that I'm crazy for not seeing how platonic everything is for the rest of my life. It seems like trying to convince someone to like different food or to have a different favorite color. I'm unhappy about this, and I no longer want to feel these feelings. There is no need for this to be mutual. I do not need your permission to break up with you. He wrote me an apologetic email in which he accepted responsibility for most things without any argument, except he denied anything that had to do with his relationship with her, making me uncomfortable. He denied that I would be unable to handle their relationship. He said my perspective was the only thing that made their trip bad for me. I told him that trust has to be built and that he put too much strain too early on a relationship in which we had not developed that trust. He agreed and apologized. For me, it ended on a pretty amicable note, but this style of relationship doesn't work for me, and I don't feel like his responses to me really healed or changed anything significantly. I stand by my decision at this point.